Hello and welcome to my video all about how to finish your polymer clay pieces. As you can see here, I have 3 discs of clay. I've just made these from some scrap clay and tried to make them about the same size. The first piece has a black mark on the back, and this one I baked for twice the recommended time. So I baked that one for an hour. The reason I did this was because I read that if you bake the clay for longer, it becomes harder, and when it becomes harder, you're able to get a stronger shine on the finished clay. So I just wanted to experiment and see if that was actually the case. The second piece of clay is just a flat disc and was baked for the recommended time. And the third piece was also baked for the recommended time, but I've made the surface all uneven and also added some little dents and fluff to the surface. The reason I did this was basically to give me a challenge and see if it's possible to make something this messy into a nicely finished piece. Now the first thing I'm going to do with the messy piece of clay is use some acetone on the surface. What you want is 100% acetone because that's the strongest stuff, and what you don't want is coloured acetone, so make sure it's clear 100% acetone. I'm just using some acetone pads which are used to remove nail polish. The reason for using acetone is that it's great for removing little bits of fluff or dust or lint or even fingerprints from the very upper surface of the clay. It can't remove anything that's embedded deep in the clay, but if it's just on the top surface, then acetone does wonders. Make sure you have good ventilation and then just wipe the acetone across the surface of the clay. If you're using the liquid version of acetone in a bottle, then just dip a cotton bud or Q-tip into the acetone and use that to apply it to the clay. The acetone sort of dissolves the very top layer of the clay, so what you want to do is just try and wipe away all of the lint and anything that's on that surface. Just wipe it away. If the acetone doesn't work for you because the lint or dust is too embedded inside the clay, then the other options you have are to A. Use sandpaper on the surface of the clay until you get down to where that piece of hair or lint or dust is, and then you can remove it. B. You can paint the clay, so basically you're covering up any of the bits that are embedded in the clay. The best paint to use on clay is acrylic paint. Or C, you can texture the clay in order to disguise any little bits that are embedded in the clay beneath. So you could use a toothbrush or a sponge, for instance, to add a texture. Acetone also has another use, and that is when you've baked your clay, sometimes the area of clay that's in contact with the baking tray or whatever you've baked the clay on goes shiny, and acetone can be rubbed on those shiny spots to sort of mattify those areas and not make them so shiny. So in conclusion, acetone is a very useful thing to have if you like working with clay. Make sure that after you've used the acetone, you wash your piece so that there's no acetone remaining on the surface and leave it to dry thoroughly. In my previous video about how to get started with polymer clay, I went through quite a few ideas for how to prevent adding fingerprints or lint or dust into your clay in the first place. Of course, prevention is always the best idea, and if you manage to prevent those things, then the finishing time that you have to put into the clay is a lot less, so it does save you time overall. If you find it difficult to keep your clay 100% clean, then I would definitely suggest not using white clay. White clay is notoriously difficult because any speck of dust or dirt or anything shows up very clearly. Now the next step of finishing this clay is the sanding stage. I first want to show you some sanding sponges that I bought that are designed specifically for clay, and I bought them in rough, medium and fine grades, and so those are an option for you to use. However, what most people will have access to is just normal sandpaper, so that's what I'm going to use for this demonstration. I would personally recommend using silicon carbide wet and dry sandpaper. And I would recommend using 3 different grades or 3 different grits of sandpaper. So in my case, I used the grit of 320 first, and then I used a grit of 600, and finally a grit of 1200. So here are the 3 grits I'm using, and I bought them as A4 sheets. Obviously you don't need to use the whole A4 sheet for the sanding, so you just cut off the amount you want to use. Talking generally about sandpaper, 320 to 400 grit is considered fine, and so with polymer clay we're starting off using a fine sandpaper. The lower the grit number, the coarser and larger the abrasive particles on the paper are. So 320 is the coarsest sandpaper I'll be using, and 1200 will be the finest. The idea is to work your way from the roughest to the finest paper so that the clay becomes smoother and smoother as you work. When you're sanding a material, what you're basically doing is scratching that material. So with 320 grit, you're putting in larger scratches than you would with a 1200 grit paper. So even when I've finished with the 1200 grit paper, there will still be microscopic scratches in my work. However, you're not going to be able to see them with the eye, so 1200 is as high as you need to go. Sanding is best done underwater. The reason for this is that because if you sand with water, that water collects all the dust that you're removing from the clay. So instead of that dust going up in the air and you breathing it in, that dust is collected in the water. So it's just better for your health, basically. I'm going to be doing this at a sink, but you can do this over a washing bowl full of water, for instance, instead. In terms of the water, I use tepid water. Colder water makes the clay a bit stiffer, whilst very warm water makes the clay a bit softer. So I tend to stick in the middle, especially because I don't want cold hands. And I also put a drop of washing up liquid in the water. So I take my piece of 320 grit first and dip it in the water. I then just start rubbing the clay with that sandpaper. The roughest grit is for removing a little bit of the clay material. So this is your chance to remove fingerprints or dents or do any shaping of the clay. As you're sanding, keep dipping the paper into the water to clean it because the clay dust can clog up the paper. If there's quite a bit of the clay material that you want to remove, for instance you want to do quite a bit of shaping to your piece, then you could go for a coarser grit, maybe around 220, just to make that job a little quicker. Once you've used the roughest grit all over and you've done all the shaping you want to do, then it's time to move on to the next sandpaper. So in my case I'm using 600 grit now, and this is obviously the step between the roughest and the finest. This paper will allow you to make your clay smoother, so just go all over your clay with it and try and remove any scratches that have been left by the roughest grit sandpaper. Once you've used it all over, then it's time to move on to the fine sandpaper. In my case, 1200 grit. Because this is the final paper, you want to use it all over and use it until the clay is as smooth as you want it to be. I would recommend doing about 5 minutes with this fine grit to see where that gets you. Just try and sand the whole surface evenly. I keep some kitchen towel nearby so that I can dry the clay if I want to check how it's coming along and see what progress I'm making. Then when you're finished, you clean the sink. You can use something like a Dremel to sand your clay if you need to do some kind of dramatic or extreme shaping. However, otherwise I definitely wouldn't recommend it because it's very easy to make a mistake, and the high power of a Dremel means that you end up taking a lot more clay off the surface than you maybe intend to. I think with sanding it's often tempting to either not do it or cut corners with it, but you really won't get a great finish unless you do the sanding stage. Here you can see the clay discs after I have finished sanding. You You can see that they currently have a smooth but matte finish. So to add a bit more shine to the clay, we now buff the clay. Now there's a few ways to buff clay. One way of buffing is to use a fabric to rub vigorously against the clay. This can be denim or t-shirt jersey or microfiber cloth, but just be careful if you're buffing light coloured or white clay. Make sure that you don't use a fabric that's going to transfer dye onto your clay surface. So obviously don't use new denim, but use some old faded or even white denim. All you do is rub the fabric against the clay all over until it's nice and shiny. If you have a Dremel or rotary tool instead, then you can do the buffing stage a lot quicker. I simply put a buffing wheel or polishing cloth into the Dremel and use it on low speed against the clay surface. Make sure that if you do this, you tie back any long hair, you don't wear long sleeves, and you wear safety glasses as well. I used my Dremel at a speed of 10,000 RPM. Hold the clay tightly in your hand and move the buffing wheel across the clay surface whilst pressing onto the clay lightly. You don't want to be pressing the buffing wheel hard onto the clay because this could cause the clay to flip out of your hand. All you need is a light touch. Just let the tool do the work for you. You can choose to skip this buffing stage if you just want a smooth matte finish that the sanding gives you. However, buffing just gives that nice extra shine. As you can see, it doesn't take long for a bit of shine to be added to the clay surface. You can see the shine there on the top half of this clay disc, and you simply carry on buffing all over until all of the clay has that nice shine to it. Obviously, the more you buff, the more shine you will get on your clay. So now I'm just going to do that for all the clay discs and come back to you. It might just be my imagination, but I do think the clay that I bake for longer does have a slight bit more shine. However, I don't think it's a noticeable difference. Okay, so that's the first two stages finished, the sanding and the buffing. The buffing stage is actually optional. You can just leave it with a smooth matte finish after the sanding. Once you've finished buffing, there might be little fibres on the clay, so just give that a clean and leave to dry before you continue. You want to make sure that the clay is very clean before you add any other finish, whether that's a varnish or a paint. What we have here is 3 discs of bare clay, and that's completely impermeable, so you don't have to add any kind of finish at all if you don't want to. However, it depends on the look that you want. There are quite a few options for what you can put on top of clay. If I want to add a protective coating to the clay and I want to maintain a matte finish, then usually what I go for is the Rust-Oleum Clear Protective Spray as seen here. That one's my favourite for adding a matte finish. The benefit of using a clear spray over something that you brush on is that you can add it over something like gold foil or pastels that you have added onto the clay and could be brushed off. So if you've added anything to clay that could be easily damaged or removed, then using a spray instead of a brush to apply the finish is ideal. Other options for what to add on top of the clay include Fimo Gloss Varnish, which is one I'm going to use. Different brands do their own gloss or matte varnishes and glazes, so there is quite a variety on the market. For instance, Sculpey have varnishes available as well, and these are aimed specifically at using with polymer clay. You could also paint your clay with acrylic paint. If you do add acrylic paint, you will need to protect the paint because it can scratch off the surface of clay. So you will still need to add a sealer or a varnish on top of the paint. The useful thing about paint is that it does cover many sins. And also you can get away with not producing a high finish on your clay surface. For instance, you don't need to go overboard sanding the clay, and you won't need to buff if you're going to be painting the clay. If you want to use the paint to add details, then make sure you use fine paint brushes and tools with fine points so that it doesn't look messy or clumsy. I'm also going to use Triple Thick Gloss Glaze, so you'll see how that comes out a little bit later on in the video. And the other finish I'm going to use is Pledge Wood Floor Care Finish. Funnily enough, there are a few wood care products out there that are perfect for using on polymer clay. Future Floor Finish or Rust-Oleum Varathane Crystal Clear Interior Finish are popular choices if you can get hold of them. And other options for finishes include epoxy resin, Renaissance wax polish, Liquitex varnish, jewellery resin, Mod Podge Dimensional Magic, or sprays like PYM2. The finishes will either come in a spray or with a brush provided, or sometimes if they're in a bottle you'll need to apply layers of it using a cotton bud or Q-tip. One thing I would add is not to use nail polish on the surface of clay. A lot of people recommend using clear nail polish, but over time that polish is likely to either go sticky or yellow, and it's just not worth the risk of ruining your work. If you're using a finish that you've not used before, then be sure to try it out first on a piece of scrap baked clay. Okay, so I've added Fimo varnish to one piece of clay, and as you can see it does add a nice subtle shine. Fimo Gloss Varnish comes in a small bottle and has a brush provided. The next finish I tried was the Triple Thick Gloss Glaze. I used a cotton bud to apply it, and it's nice and thick and gives a very hard and durable finish. In fact, it's probably more like a resin finish than something like the Fimo varnish. Unfortunately, I got a few tiny bubbles in my finish, and in hindsight I should have briefly used my heat gun on the surface just to pop those bubbles. And the final finish I used was the Pledge Wood Floor Care finish. Again, I used a cotton bud to apply it, and I applied it to the clay that I baked for double the recommended time. So the clay that had the black dot on the back. And as you can see, the finish had a really nice shine, somewhere in between the shine that I got from the Fimo varnish and the shine that I got from the Triple Thick Gloss Glaze. So as you can see, when I compare the Pledge finish to the Triple Thick finish, the Triple Thick gives a much higher shine. And comparing the Pledge to the Fimo, the Pledge has more shine. So the four finishes that I use on my clay are Rust-Oleum Clear Protective Spray for a matte finish, Fimo Varnish for a subtle gloss, Pledge for a sort of medium shine, and Triple Thick for a high shine and a durable finish. As for the cost of all of them, you can see that they come in a wide range of container sizes. The Fimo, obviously you get in a very small bottle, and the Pledge comes in a very large bottle. I think I paid about £14 for the Pledge, but you do get a lot of it, and that is going to last me probably forever. And if I compare that to the Triple Thick Gloss Glaze, I paid about £8 or £9 for that container, and then I paid about £5 for the Fimo varnish. So per milliliter, Pledge is the best deal, but if you only do occasional polymer clay crafting, you'll probably be best with the Fimo varnish because it's a small bottle, but it'll still last you quite a long time. So in conclusion, to get a high shine, I would recommend baking the clay for a good amount of time. I would say more than the recommended time, just to make sure it's very hard and solid. And then you need to sand from a rough grit to a very smooth grit. Then you need to buff that clay until you get the shine you want. And then if you want, you can add your choice of final finish. I really hope this video has been helpful to you, and thank you very much for watching.